You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. My guest is Jessica Lovering. She's the director of Breakthrough's Energy Program, and they work on nuclear energy policy. So, Jessica, thanks for coming. How you doing?
Hey, good. How are you doing?
All right. Yeah, I'm interested to talk to you. I haven't talked to anyone in the world of nuclear power ever, so this will be interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, looking forward to it.
I know a little bit about nuclear power, but it seems to have a bad rap, I guess, because of Chernobyl and Three Mile Island and even Fukushima and incidents like that. So, what got you into it? How did you ever get involved in this sphere in the first place?
Yeah, that's a interesting story. I think one thing I just want to point out is I do work on all types of energy policy, but have kind of come to focus on nuclear in the last several years, in particular because of its unique opportunities, but also challenges that need to be worked out. So, how I got into nuclear was really coming from a concern about climate change. I started a master's program in environmental policy and was looking at energy in particular, as the main driver of greenhouse gas emissions, or the main source of greenhouse gas emissions. And in one of my classes, we were doing this really simple modeling about how different countries could decarbonize, how many wind turbines it would take, how many solar panels it would take, et cetera. And looking at how seemingly simpler it was to build nuclear, at the time it was quite naive assumption, but because nuclear plants are so big, it only takes a few to power some countries. And
well, how do you compare? What's the energy output of a nice sized nuclear plant versus like a coal fired plant or some other plant?
Yeah, a nuclear plant is typically the ones we're building now are over 1 gigawatt or 1,000 megawatts. Coal plants can be that size. They're generally more like 600 megawatts. So they are roughly the same size. Nuclear tends to be bigger. And a natural gas plant may be more down now in kind of 400 megawatt size. But compared to a wind turbine or a solar panel, it's, huge. So they're good for replacing those coal plants. But what caught my attention was that no one, especially in my program, I was at University of Colorado in Boulder, was really talking about nuclear. And even I didn't realize at the time how much of the electricity in the U.S. comes from nuclear. It's about 20%. And
oh, wow.
It's, low carbon, just like wind and solar. And so it just sort of struck me that no one was talking about it. We were all very concerned about climate change, looking for, doing drastic things, big investments in renewable energy, but no one was really talking about nuclear. So that's how I got interested. And I've been working on it ever since, trying to find, why don't we have more nuclear? Why aren't other countries building more nuclear? What are the obstacles? What are some of the big benefits? And particularly from a policy perspective, what can be done?
Yeah, I guess I was going to joke with you and say when it comes to careers, you took the nuclear option.
I've heard that before.
Oh, man, I thought it was a new joke. But, again, what have you found? So you decided to, I guess, focus your efforts in this area. But I guess to start with, what do friends and relatives say? And then what has the people that you work with say, and in other scientific disciplines and everything? Do they say, "Oh, great idea," or are you getting flack for wanting to work in this area? What's it been like?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a generational divide. My parents come from a generation that's just sort of implicitly anti-nuclear. I'm from California, and so there's definitely that feeling there. But most people, I still don't. Maybe the general population doesn't know a lot about nuclear. And what I found with sort of my generation, which is a bit younger, is that we don't have a lot of the same kind of baggage around the technology. And because so many people, at least in my circles, are really interested in, air pollution and climate change and environmental protection, they're a little more open to ideas around clean energy than maybe their parents' generation. So I was particularly surprised when I moved back to California to start working at the Breakthrough Institute and working on nuclear. I'd go to a lot of like clean energy events or clean tech kind of networking events, and meeting people that work in renewables, particularly solar in San Francisco area. And I told them I work on nuclear. People were generally pretty positive and like, oh, that's really cool. And just sort of we both work in clean tech kind of attitude, which I wasn't expecting. And I think I started really seriously working on nuclear about 6 years ago. And what surprised me the most, I think, is one, that there's all these new companies working on nuclear. It's not just the same old, GE and Westinghouse trucking away. There's a lot of innovation going on, a lot of new ideas about how to use nuclear and how to deploy nuclear power around the world. And the second thing was looking at decarbonization in the past. So how countries reduced their emissions, in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't motivated by environmental reasons. It was due to the oil crisis. But countries that, got off oil to a large extent really fast actually did it with nuclear power, which I didn't really know about or, think about nuclear being used in that way. But a lot of countries in Europe did these big nuclear build-outs in the 70s, and you can see this major shift in where their energy comes from across the board. Their emissions drop, but also their oil imports drop, and that was really dramatic to me because that's sort of the thing that's definitely what we need to be seeing now, getting off of fossil fuels, and seeing it actually happen and actually work was really surprising to me.
I guess the downside, though, is if something goes wrong, there's an accident. I mean, look at Chernobyl. There's areas that are going to be contaminated for supposedly 35,000 years. And, there's like the Hanover site. I mean, if things go wrong with nuclear, it could have a consequence for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and the area could never, ever be used again.
That's definitely how a lot of people think of nuclear, and why, particularly on the environmentalist side, there's a lot of hesitation around it. I think it's pretty complex. I mean, Chernobyl is sort of the most extreme case we have, and there weren't that. It was a terrible tragedy, but today it's a manageable one. And I think the thing that I won't discount the accident there, but just the context is that it was in the Soviet Union at the time, and they did a lot of bad things in a lot of industries, and covered up a lot of different types of accidents. And it was a nuclear accident there. But, people live in that area now. They're managing that problem. There's people that work around the plant. They're still doing the cleanup. And so for how much electricity nuclear is provided globally, the amount of sort of mortality impacts that it's had has been tiny compared to, coal, oil, even hydro has a lot more kind of accidents that we don't really think about. And so I don't want to minimize kind of the historic problems that nuclear has had, but to say that on the whole, it's very safe. It's had a really good track record. A lot of the really bad sort of contamination events that we think about with nuclear, like Hanford, which you mentioned, Sellafield in the UK, are really from the weapons complex, so military sites, and they get grouped together in people's minds, which is understandable. But the nuclear power industry has had a much better record in terms of safety and transparency more recently, and proper management of their material. So I think there's one thing to deal with the historic legacy, which is a challenge, but looking forward to the new technologies, the new reactor designs that companies are working on and starting to deploy, they have a lot of inherent safety features that make it so they can't have those types of accidents. And that's sort of where we're seeing the future of nuclear going, and what gets people excited about it.
So what are some of the new developments in nuclear, in addition to the safety? Are there different mechanisms by which they create the power? I mean, what kind of details can you give?
Yeah, so kind of the closest technology that's going to be deployed, sort of built first, is not too radical, but it is in its business case, which is small modular reactors. So those are kind of the same technology as the big plants we have now. They're just much smaller and built kind of on a assembly line, like in a factory. So the idea is to make them much cheaper and faster to build. And there's a company that's currently going through the licensing stage right now in the U.S. and looking to build their first plant in kind of the early 2020s. That's NuScale. And their reactor is 50 megawatts, which is big still, but much smaller than a 1,000 megawatt plant that we have today. And they do have the way the geometry of the plant is, they can rely in an accident on convective cooling. So that's, everyone can sort of intuit this process where, in a very tall cylinder, the hot water is going to go to the top, and then it's going to come back down as it cools and kind of start that cycle. That's kind of a natural cooling process. So what happens is if there's an accident, you can rely on that process. You don't have to have, make sure all your pumps are working to pump new cooling water into that reactor for weeks. You can rely on that natural cooling. And that's really important because that's been where, accidents, like at Fukushima, the big challenge was they couldn't get cooling water in. They had to keep pumping in new cooling water. So that's one of those inherent or passive safety features that's really important to new nuclear. Going beyond the small modular reactors, almost all of the designs that people are working on use a different coolant than water.
Were they using like heavy water or something?
Yeah, so Canada still uses heavy water as their coolant for a different reason. But water, any kind of water, the challenge is that it boils at a pretty low temperature and becomes steam, and then you have to pressurize that steam and keep it in a container, which is how you get these big, heavy steel vessels that have to keep that pressure in. So most of the advanced nuclear designs that people are working on don't use water as their coolant. They use something that stays liquid at very high temperatures. So things like molten salts, liquid metals, or there's also companies working on gas-cooled designs. So they don't have any liquid in there. They have high-pressure gas. That's a different design. But for the ones, particularly molten salt and liquid metal, the big benefit is that you don't have to have these really thick vessels holding all that pressure in. And also, when the reactor gets really hot, you're not worried about your liquid boiling off. It's like a big pot of soup that kind of keeps things, cool as a relative term, because they are very hot, but the coolant stays liquid. And they have a lot of safety benefits. They really can't have those types of accidents because you can't really lose the coolant. And also, there's a lot of different fuels that these designs are using that can't melt because they're just able to withstand much higher temperatures. And so that's the big worry with any of our light water reactors today is when the fuel melts, that's when you get release of these sort of dangerous materials. So yeah, those are the big picture benefits or attributes of these new designs that why people think it's really a game changer for nuclear.
What about the atoms themselves? What are the plutonium, uranium? I mean, what do they use now versus in the past, or is it the same?
Yeah, it's going to be roughly the same still, mostly uranium. Actually, think all the giants are still uranium fuels. Different structures. So some are looking at using metal fuels instead of oxide fuels. I won't go into that. But one of the challenges for these new companies is that right now most fuel in the U.S. is or in the world really is enriched to less than 5%. So you need a certain amount of uranium-235. That's the sort of good stuff in uranium fuel, but natural uranium is mostly uranium-238, so different isotopes. So you need to enrich it sort of get more of that uranium-235 in the fuel. And light water reactors around the world today are kind of 3 to 5% U-235, whereas a lot of these designs want to go up kind of closer to 20%. There's a pretty strong limit on 20% for non-proliferation reasons. When you start to go above 20%, it gets a little concerning for countries that might be secretly working on weapons. So 20% is kind of a standard where we don't want people to go above 20%. But a lot of these companies are looking at fuels that go kind of 10 to 20%, and that supply chain is not available right now. So that's one of the challenges, is figuring out who's going to make that fuel, where's it going to be made. It'd be great to make it in the U.S. And there's actually legislation that was introduced in the Senate a few weeks ago, kind of looking at taking some excess enriched uranium that the Department of Energy has and seeing if they could kind of make some of the first batches of fuel as kind of a way to jumpstart the first demonstrations of these reactors, providing sort of a guaranteed supply of this higher enriched uranium fuel.
Well, what about spent fuel rods that exist anymore? What kind of products are created, and how long are they alive, with their half-lives, and what do you do with them?
Yeah. So the U.S. has all of our spent fuel from our entire history of nuclear energy production. We're not really doing anything with it. We had a plan. We had actually a federal policy put it in Yucca Mountain, but that's kind of stalled. And one reason that's not such a bad thing is that there's actually still a lot of energy in spent fuel. About 96% of the energy that you could get out of it is still in there. So kind of burying it underground permanently doesn't seem like a great idea from an energy perspective. It's kind of like using a AA battery, just 4% of the energy, and then tossing away. So we still need to deal with that problem, even if we stopped making nuclear power today, and even if we built a whole bunch of new fancy advanced reactors, we still need to find something to do with that fuel. So one thing that other countries do is reprocessing. So sort of like recycling the fuel. You kind of chop it up, do some chemical processes, and you can use that. Really, you get the plutonium out and use it again, or use it in commercial nuclear power. And that's one thing you can do with it. There's also different ways that you can recycle fuel with some of these advanced reactors. So some of them kind of use spent fuel directly as fuel. Some of them you might need reprocessing, but a lot of them, because they're different designs, it's very different. But there's most of them are making waste that's not as radioactive and radioactive for shorter time periods. So they're burning up more of the material in the fuel. So anything that's sort of using fuel more efficiently is good. And some of them, there's certain reactor designs that are liquid fueled, which is very different than what we do now. Instead of having solid fuel rods, you have the fuel as a liquid that's going through the reactor, and you can get a lot more of the energy out because you just keep using it over and over again. And then there are several companies working on fast reactors, which they use neutrons in a different way than all the reactors that we have today, which are what are called thermal neutron reactors, won't go into the details, but they're actually much better at either burning up material, sort of radioactive material, or making new fuel. So if you were looking towards a more sustainable nuclear fuel cycle, you'd want to be going towards more fast reactors in the future. And that's why there was a big push around fast reactors in the U.S., France, and Japan, kind of in the 70s, because we were looking at thinking there was going to be a very big build out of nuclear and worried about that we wouldn't have enough fuel. So looking at how to, get more energy out of that fuel and also use that fuel more times, recycle it, and kind of get every last drop out of our radioactive material, which also the benefit is there's a lot more waste at the end. Oh, sorry, a lot less waste at the end.
When was the last time, when was the latest, newest nuclear reactor put up in the U.S.?
Actually, we had one come online, Bar 2, came online a few years ago, but that was one that was started. It was started construction in the 80s, and it was halted for a long. So it was sort of canceled, but not really. And then it came online just 2016. So pretty recently. But we have two big ones under construction at the Vogel plant in Georgia. So two big 1,100 megawatt Westinghouse designs. And so those are expected to come online in sort of the next few years. So those will be our first kind of really new designs to come online in 30 years.
Okay. What do you think is possible? You said about 20% of the U.S.'s energy is nuclear right now. What do you think is possible, and how many plants need to do it?
Yeah, so, anything's really possible. What sort of, my vision, I think right now renewables are growing a lot, and that's great. I think renewables do face a challenge where as you get to higher penetrations in the market, they get more expensive instead of less expensive because of grid issues and intermittency issues. So I think we want to see nuclear expand to kind of displace more fossil fuels, particularly coal, and sort of to complement those growing renewable shares. So I think, definitely doubling the U.S. nuclear capacity is very possible, going up to 40% of our generation. 20% of our electricity comes from nuclear, but it's only at about 67 power plants. So you can really, think about those plants. They have very small footprints where they are. They employ a lot of people in their communities. And so it's not unreasonable to think about doubling them. You could almost do it at a lot of these existing sites. You just build, another reactor at a site and a community that's very familiar with the technology. And that's something that is one of the drivers of small modular reactors, is that they could be built at existing nuclear power plant sites a lot more easily. The other idea, something that NuScale has floated, is that if you put 12 of their reactors together, you get about 600 megawatts, which is about the size of a lot of coal plants in the U.S. And the nice thing about coal power plants, sort of one nice thing about them, is they already have the transmission line infrastructure for the electricity, and they're already, like a brownfield site. They're already an industrial site. So it might be easier to build an SMR, a small nuclear plant there to replace that coal plant. And that would be really good for, air pollution, and also be a little bit easier construction-wise because, it's already a built-up site, already has those transmission lines. It's already sort of ready from the grid's perspective for a new generator to be built there. And so looking at, how many coal plants you could, if you got in the business of replacing coal plants with small nuclear, there's a huge opportunity there because the U.S. has a lot of coal plants, and a lot of them are getting pretty old and kind of ready to be shut down anyway. So I think there's a huge potential there. So if you were really good at replacing coal plants, and then also sort of building more smaller reactors at existing nuclear power plant sites, you could get up to, I think, 40 or 50% of the U.S. electricity, not unreasonable, and then have renewables fill in the rest of that, and maybe a good amount or a reasonable amount of natural gas with carbon capture could be the rest.
Okay. Well, very good. So what do you see as the near-term future, the likely future of nuclear over the next 5-10 years in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think we're at a really exciting turning point. So there's, people are waiting for NuScale to start their first construction of their first plant and see how that goes, which we will definitely see in the next 5 years. But there's also about 5 or 6 of these non-light water reactor designs that are in sort of pre-licensing talks with the regulator in the U.S., and they're looking at starting licensing in the next few years and seeing their first demonstrations get built in maybe within 5 to 10 years will be really cool, because it will be technologies that we've never seen before built at a commercial level in the U.S., and there's going to be several different ones. So a variety of technologies getting demonstrated around the U.S. At a commercial scale. And I think once we will see that happening, I said, kind of 5 to 10 year time period, and they're, real, and people can go and see them and ask questions and talk to people that work there. I think that's going to be where people start to get really excited and see that it's really happening. These new, very different nuclear designs, and so I think that's what I'm looking forward to, and I think people are waiting for that point to sort of make their final judgments on what the future of nuclear really looks like.
Very good. Well, Jessica, I appreciate you coming, and it's been interesting. So, thanks for being here. For people that want to find out more, from Breakthrough or about nuclear in general, what resources do you have for them?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is go to our website, thebreakthrough.org. We do a lot of different environmental policy work across all sorts of issues. And also, if you want to just kind of follow more on what's happening with advanced nuclear, I'd say follow me on Twitter. It's at @J_Lovering. And thanks for having me. It's been a really great conversation.
Oh, good.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.